In 1975, a 23-year-old bodybuilder walked onto the Mr. Olympia stage believing he had a real shot at beating the most famous man in the sport. He didn't win. That loss set off one of the most eventful lives in Hollywood, one that includes a role he almost lost to someone else, an injury that nearly ended his career while he was saving his own daughter, a brush with a real assassination plot, and a family tragedy he is still living through today. This is the story of what happened after the cameras stopped rolling on Pumping Iron. Before any of that, there was a kid in Brooklyn who struggled to stay in school. Lou Ferrigno lost roughly 85% of his hearing before he turned 3, the result of nerve damage from a string of childhood ear infections. Teachers didn't always know how to work with him. Classmates knew exactly how to be cruel. They called him Deaf Louie behind his back, sometimes to his face, and the taunting regularly turned into schoolyard fights he usually lost. He struggled with a speech impediment. He was introverted, self-conscious, and by his own account felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood. His family didn't have money for gym equipment, so at 13 he built his own weights out of 2 buckets filled with cement and a broomstick. He fell in love with comic book Superman, and later the Hulk because they gave him somewhere to disappear into. He has said that reading those comics after a bad day was the only thing that kept him from feeling completely defeated. Bodybuilding gave him something else, a sport where nobody needed to hear him to respect him. By the time he graduated high school in 1969, he had already won his first major title, Mr. America. 4 years later, at just 21, he became the youngest person ever to win Mr. Universe, then defended the title again the following year. He briefly played professional football in the Canadian Football League before deciding bodybuilding was the path forward, and in 1976, he moved to California to pursue it full-time. There, he crossed paths with a 5-time Mr. Olympia champion who was about to become the most important rival of his career, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Ferrigno was not originally positioned as the star of the film. Pumping Iron began as a documentary that investors considered unpromising box office material. Footage of men doing squats and sit-ups was not seen as commercially appealing. So the filmmakers George Butler, Robert Fiore, and Charles Gaines made a decision that would shape how the world saw both men for the next 50 years. They built a story, an underdog against a reigning champion, confident, magnetic Schwarzenegger as the smiling favorite, quiet, intense 6'5" Ferrigno as the outsider trying to dethrone him. Pumping Iron centers on the build-up to the 1975 Mr. Olympia, where Ferrigno's size and hunger were presented to audiences as a real threat to Schwarzenegger's reign. Much of that framing, however, was shaped after the fact through editing rather than reflecting the competition as it actually unfolded. Ferrigno admitted something years later that surprised a lot of his fans. Some of the most memorable scenes in the film, including the ones showing his father training alongside him, guiding him, pushing him, were largely staged for the cameras. In real life, his father wasn't much of a training partner at all. Their relationship was more complicated than that, closer to love and tension than a Rocky-style montage. The filmmakers needed an underdog narrative, and a devoted father in his corner made for better cinema than the messier truth. Ferrigno has also said, looking back, that he simply wasn't the person he needed to be at that moment. He was younger, less experienced on camera and in competition, thrown into a rivalry with a man who'd already spent 5 years as the face of the sport. He has called it one of his regrets, not because he lost but because he knows now he wasn't fully prepared for what he was walking into. He lost. On the Mr. Olympia stage in 1975, Schwarzenegger took the title, his 6th. Ferrigno went home without the trophy the entire film built toward. On paper, that was the end of the story. In practice, it was only the beginning. Pumping Iron premiered at a theater in New York in January of 1977 on a budget of about $1 million, and it did something nobody in bodybuilding had managed before. It made the sport look mainstream. Schwarzenegger's charisma turned him into a Hollywood prospect almost overnight. Television producers were watching too, and a man named Kenneth Johnson was searching for someone enormous enough to physically become the Hulk on screen. Ferrigno wasn't the producer's first choice. They initially considered Arnold Schwarzenegger himself, but he wasn't tall enough for what they had in mind. They then cast actor Richard Kiel, who would later become known as the metal-toothed villain Jaws in the James Bond films. But once shooting began, it was clear Kiel didn't have the muscular build the role demanded. Even the director's own son said Kiel didn't look like the Hulk from the comics. With production already underway, the producers went looking for the only person in Hollywood who had both the height and the physique to pull it off. That search led them back to the 6'5", 285-pound bodybuilder who had just lost to Schwarzenegger on camera. Ferrigno auditioned, was painted green on the spot, and was hired before he left the room. The role that grew out of losing to Schwarzenegger ended up making Ferrigno a household name in his own right. The Incredible Hulk ran on CBS from 1978 to 1982 and turned him into a pop culture fixture for an entire generation. Playing the character was harder than it looked. Getting into makeup for each episode took roughly 3.5 hours and involved 6 layers of green body paint, applied like dry chalk over his entire body. He has described the process as feeling like being a prisoner, stuck under lights for 16-hour shooting days while completely covered in pancake makeup that dried and cracked as he moved. Because almost no stuntman in Hollywood matched his size, Ferrigno ended up doing most of his own stunts, and the injuries that came with them were real. During one sequence that called for him to flip a car using a steel cable rig, the cable snapped mid-stunt. Exhausted and frustrated after already being on set past 4 in the morning, Ferrigno didn't wait for a replacement cable. He flipped the car himself by hand. There was a moment during this period that had nothing to do with acting at all, and most fans still don't know about it. In October of 1981, Ferrigno was scheduled to be a personal guest of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat at a public military event. At the last minute, Sadat cancelled his own appearance. Days later, Sadat was assassinated by at that same type of annual parade, along with 12 other people. It later came out that the assassins had originally planned their attack for the exact event Ferrigno would have attended, seated near Sadat. Ferrigno has said publicly that he believes, had Sadat not cancelled, he could have been killed in the attack as well. It stands as a strange, sobering footnote to a career people mostly remember for tearing shirts and painted muscles. When The Incredible Hulk was cancelled after its 5th season, the next chapter of Ferrigno's career wasn't the smooth continuation fans might assume. He didn't step into major leading roles. Instead, he took a regular part as a paramedic on a medical drama called Trauma Center, which lasted barely a single season before it too was cancelled. He picked up guest spots on shows like The Fall Guy, Matt Houston, and Night Court, along with film work that leaned heavily on his size rather than his range. Hercules in 1983, Sinbad of the Seven Seas in 1989, and a string of lower-budget action and horror films through the 90s, including titles like The Misery Brothers and Cage 2. It was steady work, but it was a long way from the mainstream spotlight The Incredible Hulk had given him. By the time Hollywood rebooted Hulk as a big-budget film in 2003, Ferrigno wasn't cast as the character at all. He appeared only in a brief cameo as a security guard, a quiet demotion from the role that had once made him famous, in the very franchise that made him famous. He returned again for a small cameo in 2008's The Incredible Hulk, voiced the character in various animated projects, and later provided motion capture and vocal work for the Hulk in several Marvel Cinematic Universe films. This makes him, to this day, the only actor to have physically portrayed the character without relying on CGI muscles, something he's proud enough of that he's brought it up publicly as a criticism of how modern superhero films rely entirely on computer effects. At 43 years old, he did something almost nobody expected. He went back into the gym to chase bodybuilding glory one more time. The 1997 documentary Stand Tall followed him as he trained for the Masters Olympia, competing again against familiar faces from his earlier career. It wasn't about proving he could beat Schwarzenegger 2 decades late. It was about proving to himself that the guy from Pumping Iron still had something left. Along the way, there were injuries far more serious than sore muscles. In one incident, Ferrigno completely tore his right bicep off the bone while rushing to protect his daughter from danger. He has described hearing a sound like fabric ripping, then looking down at his own arm and seeing it shrink to the size of a little boy's, as the torn muscle curled up into his armpit. He has said the moment devastated him, not because of the pain, but because he thought it might end his bodybuilding career outright. A football player he knew recommended a surgeon, and Ferrigno went into surgery the very next day to repair it. There was also a serious car accident in 1994, on his way to a scheduled personal appearance. Rather than cancel on the fans who'd shown up expecting him, Ferrigno pulled over, dealt with the aftermath of the crash, and still went on to do the show that night. He has talked about that decision as part of a mindset he has tried to hold on to throughout his career, the idea that showing up for people matters more than using a bad day as an excuse. Health scares followed him into his 60s as well. In 2018, at 67 years old, Ferrigno went in for a routine pneumonia vaccine and ended up hospitalized after he said the shot had been administered improperly, leaving fluid built up in his bicep. He posted photos from his hospital bed with an IV in his arm, joked that even the Hulk isn't invincible, and used the moment to warn fans to be careful and informed about how their own vaccines are given. He has also had to publicly prove he was still alive. In 2013, a parody news site published a fake story claiming Ferrigno had died in a massive highway pileup near Santa Barbara. The hoax spread fast enough that he had to respond directly, posting a video from his car on his way to the bank, telling fans point blank that he wasn't dead, and that it had been a strange, unsettling thing to wake up to. Not every hard chapter in his life came from an accident or a stunt. In more recent years, Ferrigno found himself in a legal dispute with his own brother, Andrew, and Andrew's wife over a business the two were running called Ferrigno Fitness. Lou alleged that they were using his name and image without authorization to promote their own company, a real documented rift within his own family, playing out not on a movie set but in a courtroom. Outside of acting, Ferrigno built a second identity that surprised people who only knew him as the Hulk. His father had spent 26 years as an NYPD officer, and Ferrigno grew up with a deep respect for law enforcement. In 2006, he was sworn in as a Los Angeles County Reserve Deputy Sheriff, committing to at least 20 hours of service every month, and later worked 30 to 40 hours monthly for the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office. Over the years, multiple police departments across the country, including agencies in New York, Texas, and California, made him an honorary or reserve officer. He has gone on ride-alongs, appeared at community events, and spoken publicly about why he believes officers deserve more support, not less, especially as crime has surged in some communities. But the part of his life he has talked about most openly in recent years isn't bodybuilding, acting, or law enforcement. It's his hearing. Ferrigno spent most of his career managing his hearing loss with traditional hearing aids. As he got older, they stopped being enough. A friend who had gone through similar hearing loss encouraged him to look into a cochlear implant, a device typically recommended for people with 40% hearing loss or worse. He had the surgery at 69. He has said publicly that he wishes he had done it 10 years earlier, describing the change as life-changing. Within weeks of the implant, his hearing improved dramatically, and he now points to that experience when encouraging others, young and old, not to be ashamed of hearing loss or to wait as long as he did to seek help. He has since become one of the more visible advocates for the deaf and hard of hearing community. He visits non-profit organizations, speaks to police departments about communicating with deaf civilians, and has pushed for training programs that have since been adopted in multiple cities. For a kid who was once asked to leave a classroom because he couldn't hear the teacher, this advocacy has become one of the defining missions of his later life. His family has been part of the story as well. His daughter Shana Ferrigno has built her own acting career, including a recurring role on Days of Our Lives, along with work as a published author and producer. His son Brent has appeared on reality television and built a following around health and fitness, often crediting his father's discipline as the foundation for his own approach. Ferrigno has said in interviews that watching his children build careers separate from the Hulk name has been one of the quieter sources of pride in his later life. In October of 2023, Ferrigno shared one of the harder chapters of his life publicly. His wife Carla was diagnosed with severe dementia, a diagnosis that has significantly affected her ability to care for herself. Carla had been far more than a spouse in the public eye. She worked alongside him for decades building their fitness brand, appeared with him at events, and was widely regarded as the steady partner behind his larger-than-life persona. Watching that same partner lose pieces of herself to a condition with no cure is a loss that Ferrigno has discussed with the same directness he has brought to talking about his own hearing loss. Not for sympathy, he has said, but because he believes staying quiet about hard things doesn't help anyone. Age has continued to slow him down without stopping him. In recent years, he has had to cancel scheduled fan convention appearances due to illness, disappointing crowds who had bought tickets specifically to meet him, a sign that the body that once did its own stunt work now requires more careful management than it used to. He has spoken openly about balancing that reality with a packed schedule of appearances, interviews, and advocacy work. Through all of it, he has remained candid in a way many former action stars are not. He has written 2 books, one on his approach to bodybuilding, and the other a behind-the-scenes account of what it was actually like living inside the Hulk costume and character during his 5 years on CBS. He has talked about his mentor relationship with Marvel's Stan Lee, whom he has described as almost a second father, guiding him through decades of staying connected to a character that could easily have become a limitation rather than a legacy. Well into his 60s and 70s, he has continued taking on new roles, including horror and action films made outside the traditional Hollywood system, still showing up on set the way he once showed up to a fan appearance minutes after a car accident. People who only know Ferrigno from movie posters or comic conventions tend to picture the character, not the man underneath the makeup. Strip away the green paint and the torn shirts, and what's left is a fairly unusual American story. A kid expected to struggle his whole life because of a disability, who instead built a body and a career loud enough that the world forgot to notice the hearing aid, then quietly returned to that same disability decades later to help other people not feel as alone as he once did. That story started on a bodybuilding stage in 1975. Lou Ferrigno lost the competition. Pumping Iron was built around, and the film wasn't fully honest about how that underdog story came together. He nearly lost his career to a torn bicep, nearly lost his life to an he wasn't even the target of, was hospitalized by a medical mistake, and had to convince the entire internet he wasn't dead. Losing to Schwarzenegger put him in front of the right camera at the right time, and everything that followed, the good and the genuinely hard, became a life that had almost nothing to do with who won in 1975. The kid who got called Deaf Louie became the Hulk. The guy whose Olympia loss was the whole plot of the documentary ended up with the longer, stranger, more resilient career. More than 50 years after a camera crew decided he needed to lose on screen to make a better film, Lou Ferrigno is still standing in front of the cameras, telling people what actually happened.